Pam Bondi walked into the federal courthouse expecting a battle. She knew the judge assigned to the case had a reputation for arrogance, for cutting down lawyers in his courtroom like it was sport. But what she didn't expect was the moment that would shock everyone watching, when that same judge was escorted out in handcuffs before the day was over. From the beginning, it felt tense. Bondi, a former attorney general known for her calm control and legal precision, was here to defend a client in a high-stakes corruption trial. But Judge Chen had other ideas. His tone was cutting. His sarcasm dripped from every word. It wasn't just about the case. It felt personal. Pam's experience was being tested. Her patience pushed. But what the courtroom didn't know, what even the prosecution didn't suspect, was that Bondi hadn't come unprepared. She'd come with evidence that would turn the courtroom inside out. What started as a hostile hearing turned into a national reckoning. Cameras rolled, reporters gasped, and by the time it was over, the man in the black robe wasn't behind the bench. He was in custody. Did Pam go too far, or did justice finally catch up? Comment your take and subscribe for more dramatic takedowns. Pam Bondi had seen her share of high-stakes legal fights. As Florida's former attorney general, she built a reputation for being tough, precise, and unflinching under fire. Her calm demeanor in the courtroom was more than style. It was strategy. But this time, she was walking into a courtroom presided over by someone known for playing a different kind of game. Judge Chen wasn't just feared. He was loathed by many in the legal community. His reputation was built on ruthlessness. He interrupted lawyers mid-sentence, dismissed arguments with a smirk, and weaponized sarcasm from the bench. To him, court wasn't just about the law, it was about dominance. Many attorneys had been humiliated under his gavel, most left shaken. But Bondi was not most lawyers. Behind the scenes, Bondi's legal team was calm and focused. They weren't there for drama, they were there for results. Every page of evidence was meticulously prepared, every move was deliberate. While Chen relished theatrics, Bondi and her team worked like clockwork. Meanwhile, a quiet figure in the back of the courtroom observed everything. The DOJ representative, expression unreadable. Their presence was casual on the surface, but Bondi had reason to believe it was anything but routine. In the gallery, reporters and legal spectators filled every seat. They expected fireworks. What they didn't expect was a slow, undeniable shift in momentum. As the morning unfolded, the smirks turned to stares. The whispers faded. The mood began to change. And as Bondi calmly responded to Chen's provocations, the public's sympathy started to shift, from the bench to the defense table. This wasn't just another hearing. It was a powder keg waiting for the match. And everyone, whether they knew it or not, was about to become part of something much bigger. The federal courthouse in downtown Miami buzzed with tension that Tuesday morning. The air was thick with humidity and expectation. Every bench in courtroom 4B was packed. Reporters hunched over laptops, court sketch artists sizing up their subjects, and legal spectators whispering predictions about how the day might unfold. This wasn't just any hearing. The nation's eyes were locked on the case, and for good reason. A high-profile corruption trial was about to begin, and at the center of it all stood Pam Bondi. Bondi entered with quiet confidence, her tailored navy suit crisp, her expression unreadable. She moved like someone who had rehearsed this walk 100 times in her head and knew exactly when to slow her pace. Every move was measured. She greeted the court staff politely, taking her place at the defense table with practiced ease. Then the temperature in the room shifted. At exactly 9 a.m., the doors opened and Judge Chen swept in. His black robe flowed behind him, and his expression was cold, smug. He didn't glance at the gallery. He didn't need to. He already knew the room revolved around him. With his stiff posture, wire-rimmed glasses, and permanent sneer, he gave off the energy of someone who relished his reputation for making lawyers squirm. "All rise," the bailiff called out, and silence fell like a curtain. The opening moments were tense but professional, until Judge Chen looked directly at Bondi. "Ms. Bondi," he said, pausing just long enough to imply condescension, "I'm surprised to see you here, taking on something so complex." His voice was flat, but his meaning was clear. The jab hung in the air. Bondi didn't flinch. "Good morning, Your Honor. Yes, I'm lead counsel for the defense." He barely acknowledged her response. "Let's hope you're better prepared than last time," he muttered, already shuffling papers without eye contact. The room shifted. Reporters looked up. Jurors glanced at each other. The first sign of bias had landed, and everyone saw it. Bondi, still calm, opened her yellow legal pad and picked up her pen. She wasn't rattled. She was ready. Judge Edward Chen leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the bench. "Ms. Bondi, I've reviewed your latest filings," he said with a smirk, "and I must say, I'm struggling to follow your legal reasoning. Perhaps you could enlighten us with your unique interpretation of precedent." A few members of the prosecution chuckled. One leaned over and whispered to another, who covered her mouth to stifle a laugh. The tension in the room thickened. Pam Bondi stood slowly, straightening her jacket with practiced grace. "I'd be happy to clarify, Your Honor," she said, her voice even and clear. "As referenced in our brief, the precedent established in Harrison v. Miller supports our position that—" "Harrison v. Miller?" Chen interrupted, eyes wide in mock surprise. "That case was gutted by the 11th Circuit last year. I would have expected a former state attorney general to keep up with current jurisprudence." The correction was not only inaccurate, it was glaring. The case he referenced wasn't Harrison v. Miller at all. Yet Bondi didn't blink. "If I may," she said, holding up a page from her brief, "our filing outlines the distinction between Harrison v. Miller and the case you may be referring to, Harris v. Millbrook." Chen waved her off with a dismissive hand. "Save the lectures, Ms. Bondi. I've been on the bench for 22 years. I don't need a refresher from someone whose legal career has been more about press conferences than precedent." More snickers rippled through the gallery, but not from the Department of Justice observer seated silently in the last row. The woman, credentials hanging from her neck, was writing. Not furiously, but deliberately. Watching. Documenting. Bondi, meanwhile, returned to her notes. She didn't retaliate. She didn't even raise her voice. Her expression remained unchanged, a mask of professional calm. But anyone who knew her well could see the signs, the subtle tightening of her jaw, the slight emphasis in her southern drawl. She was not cracking. She was coiling. For the next hour, Chen's pattern became painfully obvious. The prosecution received generous leeway, allowed to speak at length, their objections sustained. Bondi, in contrast, was interrupted, dismissed, and corrected at nearly every turn. When she tried to present legal foundations, he rolled his eyes. When she attempted to clarify evidence, he cut her off. And still, she did not break. What no one in that room realized was that Pam Bondi had been preparing for this moment for over 6 months. She had studied Chen's rulings, his courtroom behavior, his professional history. She came armed not just with facts, but with strategy. While Judge Chen put on a performance, Bondi took notes. Each insult, each procedural misstep, each uneven ruling, documented. Her legal pad didn't show frantic scribbles. It was a methodical ledger. And through it all, in the back of the courtroom, the DOJ observer kept watching. She had seen this act before, but this time she wasn't just an observer. She was a fuse, quietly waiting to be lit. Pam Bondi stood at the podium once again, prepared to present her next argument. Her tone was deliberate, her stance unshaken. She turned to the court with a quiet confidence. "Your Honor, as established by precedent in Simmons v. Bradley, our position maintains that the procedural motion filed was both timely and within legal bounds." Before she could elaborate, Judge Chen interrupted with a scoff. Miss Bondi, Simmons was overturned in 2020 by the Seventh Circuit. Surely even a political appointee would know that. Bondi paused, eyebrows raised just slightly. Respectfully, Your Honor, she replied evenly. I believe the case you're referring to is Sampson versus Brady, and it was never binding in this jurisdiction. Her voice was calm, but her words carried weight. She flipped to a marked tab in her binder and held up the correct case law. The courtroom fell quiet. The mistake was clear. A few reporters in the gallery glanced at one another and began typing furiously. Even the prosecution team exchanged subtle glances, the smugness on their faces briefly faltering. But Judge Chen, unfazed by the correction, leaned forward with narrowed eyes. "We'll move on," he said sharply, waving away her clarification. "I don't have time to split hairs over your interpretations." Laughter, low and mocking, echoed from the prosecution's side. The moment wasn't lost on the audience, and it wasn't lost on Bondi either. Her pen moved swiftly across her yellow legal pad. She wasn't just taking notes, she was preparing a record. Every dismissive comment, every inaccurate ruling, every biased exchange. The DOJ observer in the back row watched this unfold with increasing interest. She too was writing, but unlike the journalists, she wasn't writing for headlines. She was writing for evidence. As the tension in the room built, the atmosphere began to change. What had begun as smug confidence on the bench and among the prosecution was now shifting. The gallery sensed it first. The divide between Chen's treatment of the defense and his favoritism toward the prosecution had become undeniable. This wasn't a courtroom drama anymore. It was a power play, and people were starting to notice. Bondi looked up from her notes. For the first time that morning, she didn't just respond, she took control. "Your Honor," she said clearly, "before I continue, I'd like to enter a citation for the record." She opened her binder and held up a printed sheet. Judicial Canon 2A. A judge shall act at all times in a manner that promotes public confidence in the integrity and impartiality of the judiciary. The words landed like a thunderclap in the quiet room. Judge Chen's face stiffened. His fingers drummed the bench as his eyes locked on hers. "Are you accusing this court of misconduct, Ms. Bondi?" "I'm saying that the tone, the pattern of rulings, and the imbalance of treatment suggest a concern that merits documentation," she answered without hesitation. A hush fell over the room. The reporters stopped typing. The jury leaned in slightly, and even the prosecution ceased their quiet laughter. Something had shifted. For the first time, it wasn't Bondi on the defensive. Chen's jaw tightened. "You're walking a fine line, counselor." "So is this courtroom," she replied. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, dense with consequence. Bondi returned to her seat, her legal pad now brimming with notes that were no longer about the case alone, but about the behavior of the judge presiding over it. And somewhere near the back, the DOJ observer made one final note before sliding her pen into her pocket. Things had changed, and everyone could feel it. Pam Bondi stood with the quiet confidence of someone who had waited months for this moment. The courtroom was silent as she approached the bench, holding a thick binder in both hands. Her voice was steady. "Your Honor, before I continue, I'd like to enter into the record a series of materials relevant to this court's ability to maintain impartiality in these proceedings." Judge Judge Chen narrowed his eyes. "If this is another baseless motion, Miss Bondi—" "It's not," she said, cutting in just slightly. "These are bank records, email transcripts, and internal DOJ surveillance logs, all authenticated and gathered under federal warrant." Whispers rippled through the gallery. From the back of the courtroom, two men in dark suits stood, their earpieces now clearly visible. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Bondi turned to the clerk and handed over the first batch of documents. These wire transfers originate from offshore accounts and are tied directly to judicial rulings made by Your Honor within 48 hours of each deposit. Judge Chen's mouth tightened, but he didn't speak. Bondi continued. Furthermore, enclosed are transcripts of off-the-record meetings between Your Honor and Maxwell Harrington, CEO of Gulfstream Industries, the corporation with the most to gain should this defendant be convicted. Gasps now filled the room. Members of the prosecution team shifted uneasily. Several jurors stared at the judge, expressions hard to read, but unmistakably shaken. These meetings were not disclosed. They violate judicial ethics, conflict of interest statutes, and federal law, Bondi added. Judge Chen cleared his throat. Miss Bondi, these are serious allegations. I hope you understand the gravity of what you're implying. I do, Your Honor. That's why I'm not implying. I'm presenting verified evidence. She stepped aside, motioning to her co-counsel, who rolled forward a cart stacked with 3 more evidence boxes. Then Bondi turned to face the court. Additionally, I'd like to request recusal based on a clear pattern of judicial bias and misconduct. I've outlined 14 cases over the past 2 years in which Your Honor's rulings have shown marked deviation when compared to similar cases with different counsel. Judge Chen leaned forward, attempting to keep composure. I've been on this bench for over 2 decades. I've ruled in thousands of cases. And in each of those thousands, Bondi replied smoothly, you've never had the FBI present sworn evidence of bribery, obstruction, and off-the-record communications tied to corporate beneficiaries. At that, Agent Marcus Rivera stepped forward from the rear of the courtroom. His presence, silent and still, said more than any words could. Judge Chen gripped the sides of his bench. His voice, once ironclad, now wavered. We'll recess until... I object to that, Bondi said firmly. This court has seen enough manipulation today. I respectfully request that any break be overseen by federal agents and that all evidence remain under their watch. A stunned silence settled again. One of the agents nodded slowly. The press, now fully alert, began typing and filming every detail. On Twitter, news broke before the courtroom even exhaled. Shaker Chen corruption trended within minutes. Bondi breaks. The bench followed seconds later. Judge Chen attempted one last move. You'll need more than theater to sway this courtroom, counselor. Bondi didn't flinch. This isn't theater. This is justice catching up. She turned to the clerk again. Please distribute the motion for recusal and attach supporting exhibits A through M. By now, even the prosecution team wasn't smiling. Reporters leaned forward with wide eyes. And the judge? He stared at the mountain of evidence building before him, his fingers clenching the armrests of his chair. The power he once wielded over the courtroom was slipping, and everyone could see it. Bondi's posture didn't change. She didn't need to gloat. The work had already been done. The confrontation wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. It was methodical, relentless, and precise. And as Pam Bondi returned to her seat, the only sound left in the courtroom was the quiet shuffle of paper. Justice, finally taking notes. The courtroom fell silent as the Department of Justice representative stepped forward, her expression unreadable. She addressed the judge with formality, but her words hit like a hammer. In light of the evidence presented, the DOJ formally requests an emergency suspension of these proceedings pending an internal investigation into judicial misconduct. The air thickened. No one moved. Everyone waited for what would happen next. Pam Bondi calmly approached the clerk's desk and produced a sealed envelope. This contains records of 3 prior filings submitted to this court regarding these very allegations, she said, her tone composed. Each was ignored or went mysteriously missing from the docket. The implication hung heavy in the air. Judge Chen called for a 15-minute recess, but something had changed. As he exited the bench, federal agents moved, not just to secure the evidence, but to position themselves strategically around the courtroom. 2 took places at the exits. A third stood by the judge's chambers. It was no longer just a trial. It was an unfolding federal investigation in real time. Minutes ticked by, then 20, then 35. Still no sign of Judge Chen. The press whispered. Phones buzzed. Reporters darted out of the room to file breaking headlines. Then, without warning, the side door of the courtroom opened. A woman in a charcoal-gray DOJ suit stepped in, flanked by 2 U.S. Marshals. Her voice rang out with clarity. Judge Edward Chen is currently being detained pending formal charges of corruption, obstruction of justice, bribery, and abuse of power. By order of the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, these proceedings are hereby suspended. Gasps erupted across the gallery. Jurors looked at one another in disbelief. Some reporters shot to their feet. Others simply stared, stunned. Pam Bondi did not move. She remained seated, hands folded, expression firm. She had seen this moment coming. The DOJ official continued. All cases presided over by Judge Chen in the last 5 years will be subject to formal review. A new judge will be appointed to continue these proceedings. And then came the moment that would define the day. The doors opened once more. 2 U.S. Marshals appeared, Judge Edward Chen between them, his hands cuffed in front of him. The once proud figure who just hours earlier had mocked Bondi from the bench now looked small, diminished. His face, pale and defeated, told the story. The courtroom turned silent again, not from respect, but from collective shock. As Chen was led out, cameras flashed from the press gallery. No one needed to say a word. This was the image that would make front pages across the country. The powerful man brought down not by shouting, not by politics, but by meticulous documentation and a refusal to be silenced. Pam Bondi stood slowly, collected her files, and nodded to her team. For them, the work would continue. But for the judge who once ruled the courtroom, this was the final exit. And justice had the last word. Within minutes of Judge Edward Chen's dramatic removal from the courtroom, the internet exploded. Hashtags like Chen arrested and Pam Bondi wins surged to the top of trending charts on X, formerly Twitter. Clips of the judge in handcuffs were shared across TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube, racking up millions of views before the sun had set. News vans scrambled for position outside the courthouse, while networks broke into regular programming with special reports. It wasn't just a court story anymore, it was a national reckoning. Major anchors across CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and even late-night segments couldn't stop replaying the footage. Legal commentators filled studio panels, debating the ethics of judges behaving like unchecked monarchs and praising Bondi's poised execution of a months-long strategy. Former prosecutors called it one of the boldest and most professional courtroom takedowns in modern memory. Analysts cited Bondi's methodical presentation and unwavering focus as a textbook case in how to challenge abuse without ever losing composure. Meanwhile, the Department of Justice confirmed what many suspected. A full-scale investigation into Judge Chen's prior rulings had been launched. Every case he presided over in the last 5 years would be re-examined for signs of corruption, bias, or suppressed evidence. Victims of past rulings began coming forward. Some spoke to local news stations, claiming they had always suspected something was off, but never had the power to challenge a federal judge. Now they had a chance. Through all of this, Pam Bondi stayed silent. No press conference, no social media victory lap, no dramatic interviews, just a quiet ride back to her office and a single statement from her team. The record speaks for itself. That silence was deafening and powerful. It wasn't a publicity stunt. It was the culmination of strategic integrity. The public took note. Opinion pieces ran in major publications describing Bondi as a symbol of accountability, courage, and a rare kind of calm force in a profession often marked by ego. She was being described not just as a competent lawyer, but as a standard-bearer for ethical prosecution. By the next morning, number Pam Bondi was more than a trend. It was a movement, and Judge Chen's name was etched into history, but not for the reasons he once expected. In the days following Judge Chen's arrest, the legal world shifted. Prosecutors across the country began reviewing every case the judge had presided over in the last 5 years. Internal memos were circulated within the Justice Department and state attorney offices urging immediate audits of convictions tied to his rulings. The message was clear. What happened in Courtroom 4B was not an isolated moment. It was a warning shot. Colleagues of Chen, once silent, started speaking out. Some admitted they'd long had concerns about his aggressive handling of defense attorneys and the unusually high number of convictions in cases tied to corporate interests. A former federal clerk anonymously told reporters that Chen's chambers had always felt less like a courtroom and more like a power trip. His legacy, once cloaked in prestige, had unraveled almost overnight. Pam Bondi's courtroom stand became a symbol of resistance. Legal scholars began referring to her actions as the blueprint for challenging judicial overreach. Her name filled headlines alongside terms like integrity, bravery, and reform. Protesters gathered in Washington and other major cities with signs that read, "Justice doesn't wear robes," and "Accountability starts at the bench." News outlets dubbed it the courtroom reckoning. Congress soon got involved. A bipartisan group of lawmakers called for immediate judicial oversight reforms. Hearings were scheduled. Proposals to strengthen transparency in judicial proceedings, limit unchecked discretion, and create independent review boards were introduced within a week of the incident. Meanwhile, Bondi's legal team returned to work. They weren't celebrating. They were preparing, because with the original trial suspended and Chen removed, the case would now move forward under new supervision. And this time, the world would be watching. Public support poured in. Letters, emails, social media messages, and donations to legal reform nonprofits skyrocketed. Bondi's quiet, focused pursuit of truth had awakened something far bigger than a single courtroom victory. It had sparked a movement. From coast to coast, judges were reminded that justice must not only be done, but be seen to be done. And thanks to Pam Bondi, it finally was. Pam Bondi didn't storm the court. She exposed it. What started as just another tense hearing in a federal courtroom turned into a defining moment of reckoning. With precision, preparation, and an unshakable sense of purpose, Bondi revealed the kind of corruption most only whisper about. The judge who once held the gavel in arrogance was forced to answer for every abuse of power. And the country watched, stunned, as a courtroom shifted from intimidation to accountability in real time. Now the question echoes far beyond that Miami courthouse. Should more public officials be held accountable live in court? Should the shield of prestige and title protect anyone from the consequences of their actions? Let us know what you think. Comment your thoughts below. Was this a rare victory or the beginning of something bigger? And if you believe that justice should never be untouchable, that no one is above the law, share this video with your friends and family. For more powerful moments like this, where the truth breaks through the noise and power meets its match, subscribe to the Showdown spot, where real justice plays out before your eyes.